What do you know about consciousness? I think one of the biggest questions of modern philosophy. And my guest today is not only a mathematician, neuroscientist, computer scientist, and just a giant person, he also devoted his life to understand the problem of the mind, consciousness. So please stay with us. Hi, and welcome to my channel. My name is Dr. Roy Yosevich, and in this channel, I host and speak with the most interesting and influential people from all around the world to discuss science, philosophy, theology, religion, intelligence, artificial intelligence, and neuroscience. If this is your first time here, please consider subscribing, hit the bell button, and be part of this great community. And my guest today is, and this is a true honor, Professor Stephen Grossberg. Professor Stephen Grossberg, this is going to be long. Professor Stephen Grossberg is a cognitive scientist, theoretical and computational psychologist, neuroscientist, mathematician. He is a professor emeritus of mathematics and statistics, psychological and brain science, and biomedical engineering at Boston University. In 2015, he received his Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society of Experimental Psychologists. And together with his wife, Gail Carpenter, he developed ART, Adaptive Resonant Theory. Now, his wife, which is very important, is the subject of his dedication of his latest book, his magnum opus, which is, and I had it over here, a conscious mind, resonant brain, how each brain makes a mind, which I think is a very, very big question. And in this massive book, it's not book, it's a tome, it's a giant work, he tried to discuss and explain what is consciousness and how does the brain or how the brain perform or make consciousness. Now, this book is great. It has like many chapters. For example, how the brain see, how the consciousness seeing, and invariant recognition, how do we charge in the world, and many, many other things. Some people called him, after the book, the Einstein of the mind. So without further ado, Professor Steve Grossberg, thank you so much for coming today. How are you?
I'm really well, thanks. And the modern miracle of Zoom and all of our other virtual media means we can have this chat from halfway across the world.
Yes, from the Holy Land of Israel to wherever you are, but you are going to be here. You should be, here in Israel, where the temple, when the third temple will be rebuilt.
I've lectured in Israel several times, but I no longer fly due to health reasons. So I have very fond memories and friends from there, but no more trips there.
You have some family in Israel?
What?
You have some family in Israel?
My brother has lived in Israel, in Zikron Yaakov. Yeah.
Okay. So listen, before we even start, I want to show you a picture of you, okay? And this is a great picture. Do you recognize the picture?
Yes, of course.
Now, this is your home?
But I cleaned up my study. I am in the same study. And if you look behind me, you'll see my shelves are very neat now.
Wow. So
that was a maximum entropy picture.
So I have two questions regarding this picture. One is it, or was it possible for you to be productive in such an entropy? Did you ever, manage to find what you wanted in such a chaos?
Well, first, it's one of two studies. It's not the study in which I work, where my computer is. Second, all of the files were labeled. And so, yes, I could find everything. But as I say, if you look at it now,
it's much cleaner.
It is a paragon of order. But of course, there are infinitely many works of art in it because I'm a crazy collector of African, New Guinean, Asian art and have been most of my adult life.
So now you just answered my second question. So, okay, so I know what does all this statue represent. So, okay, let's start. And before we even start, I think that we need to define the terms. You call your book Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain. Now, we know, or we think we know what conscious is, the feeling that we have ourselves, yeah? The feeling of self. And Christof Koch has his different definitions, but I think many people know what conscious is. Would you define conscious or consciousness otherwise, or the intuitive general feeling of what consciousness is sufficient for our discussion?
Well, before I try to answer a particular question like that about my book, I really need to give an overview of what my book is, what my work is about, and that will lead to a clear answer. But
okay.
I have to do a little background, and you've asked me a very big question, so I need to do that.
Okay.
In particular, you don't wake up in the morning and say, oh, today I'm going to understand consciousness. Oh, today I'm going to understand Alzheimer's disease. It's a process. So I have to tell you a little about my process. So in brief, all my work tries to explain how brain mechanisms give rise to psychological functions. And the reason is that simply brain evolution needs to achieve behavioral success.
Just a second, Steve, just a second, because you touched the paper and the paper make like noise for the microphone. So if you can not touch the paper.
Needs to achieve behavioral success.
Okay, great.
It's just another way of saying that Darwinian selection operates during evolution to shape the designs of advanced brains based on how well they're doing in the world. And that's why my book is called Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain, How Each Brain Makes a Mind. It's the interactions within and across several brain regions that are needed to generate these psychological functions when you talk about mind, because these behaviors are emergent properties of brain interactions across many parts of the brain, and purely experimental methods can't fully explain emergent properties. They can't measure them fully. And that's why we need models to bridge the gap. And to derive these models, I developed the modeling method and cycle, because you can't explain the brain in one step. And so because brain evolution needs to achieve behavioral success, the modeling method always starts with scores or even hundreds of psychological experiments, because these are the experiments that define behavior and its success. So analyzing a few experiments doesn't give you enough constraints. You have to choose whole databases, and part of the art of modeling is to know what constitutes such a database, because no one tells you this belongs with this, belongs with that. So my method shows how, by thinking about hundreds of such experiments as emerging from an individual mind operating in real time in the world, there's a speculative leap, in the words of Einstein, which leads me to realize that they're all reflecting a certain design principle. And then I convert the design principles into the minimal model that can embody it. And I use that model to explain lots more psychological data than I used to derive the model. So the first thing is to show how you can think in real time, which is the art here, if you can't think in real time, you're doomed to get design principles converted into mechanisms. And the delightful surprise to me, because I did this when I was a boy, is the models explain and predict lots of data about the brain. And that's why they're biological neural networks. I never tried to explain brain data. In particular, I didn't even know they were brain data until, I'm a freshman in college. I talk to pre-med friends who tell me about neurons, cell bodies, axons, synapses, postsynaptic clefts, transmitters. All these things were already in my model from a psychological derivation. Well, that was terribly exciting for a 17-year-old kid. And I realized by thinking in real time about big enough psychological databases, I could penetrate into the brain. And
just one thing, because you just said one thing and it like flew under the radar. You started thinking about those processes when you were a freshman, 17 years old. And in the book, you talk about, how by learning sequences or how do we learn or memorize sequences of words or letters. You came to the conclusion it was like what we call a Gedanken experiment, and just thinking through these processes. And this is just mind-blowing because it happened when you were basically a teen, 17 years old, which is, oh.
Well, that's when Newton did his work. So in science, and often in mathematics, what matters is when a certain kind of mind is first exposed to a certain kind of data and there's an explosion. I felt like my brain exploded. I was on fire. Okay.
So let me please try to re-explain. Yes.
Why I studied list learning. Why a 17-year-old kid wants to study something as boring as how you learn the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E. And the reason, so really it's about how practice makes perfect. There was a serial verbal learning literature that Carl Hove and Clark Hull and other great American psychologists had studied in great detail. And, so you might say practice makes perfect, how boring. But there was a serial position curve, a very famous curve for the after you practice till you reach a learning criterion, how many errors you make in different parts of the list, the beginning, the middle, the end. And the crazy thing was, the middle was harder to learn than either end. It's like you remember how a romance began and ended, but the middle is a muddle. This is a part of daily life. But what should have happened if you're just thinking like a computer is as you go deeper and deeper in the list, if anything.
The middle should be more easy to remember than the end.
Because there's more response interference from more items at the end than in the middle, but that wasn't true. And moreover, you would practice it on successive trials. And if you rested for a certain amount of time, more time, like it used to be, you'd present the items every 2 seconds, you might rest for 6 seconds. Or you might present them every 4 seconds, and you might rest for 2 minutes and 6 seconds. Well, if you rested longer, the entire error curve crashed, okay? So this meant, and this is what thrilled me, that the future, i.e. the non-occurrence of future items while you're resting, can influence how you remember all past items. So that meant somehow learning was going backwards in time. And what could be more thrilling for a philosophically disposed kid? And backward learning is a simpler example. So let's say I try to learn just AB. We know we can all learn an AB, but if you study it, you'll see by practicing AB, you'll also partially learn BA. So that's a backward effect. But if you present A, B, C, then we can learn ABC. So the future association BC has to be stronger than the backward association BA. So there's some kind of broken symmetry between the future and the past, and that's reflected by an asymmetry in the distribution of errors in the serial position curve, which is hardest nearer to the end of the list than to the beginning of the list. And so in summary, these are very dynamic effects. Every little thing you change in time, the rate, the rest, whatever, changes how you learn. And so I was forced to try to represent this in terms of the classical way every science represents processes occurring in real time, which is systems of differential equations, because a differential equation has a time scale that's finer than the time when any event can occur, and it can occur at unpredictable times. And in my case, because there were recurrent interactions from A, B, and from B to A, everything's interacting with everything with adaptive weights at the ends of these synapses, I was led to derive the first recurrent dissociative network when I was a kid. So that's how that happened. But then that's not the only way we understand how things occur in sequences. And before I can tell you a little about the more mature way of understanding that, I have to back up a little bit.
But just a second,
Yeah.
because with your permission, we are going to dive in later on to many of those things. But I think that we might prefer to do it in the onion method, where we start in more general and then we dive in. Okay. So again, what you said is basically mind and brain are inherently different things, because brain is a tissue that can be measured and can be analyzed in neuroscience lab, and the mind is something completely else. It's not not in the
I'm not saying that at all. All I'm saying is that our psychological experience is due to widespread recurrent interactions among many brain regions, and that at the moment we cannot fully measure all those interactions. Although colleagues of mine at MIT, like Earl can, and other people have been doing it too, can put in arrays of microelectrodes in at least 3 parts of the brain and study their dynamic interactions. And
but again,
explained a lot of their data and even predicted some of it. But the point was that you still can't totally measure it. Like if you have scalp electrodes, you can get averages of what's going on underneath. And again, I have explained and even predicted data about these event-related potentials. So there are multiple ways of looking at the elephant. And the point is, can your models explain all those levels? And my models now very often can explain psychological, anatomical, physiological, biophysical, and even biochemical data, therefore unifying explanations from multiple kinds of experiments, each of them looking at the elephant from its own perspective.
Yes, but when we are looking at the elephant from different perspectives, we usually, in the famous story, we don't get the gist of the elephant, because each blind man, when he reports what he feels something completely different from the essence of elephantness. Would you agree?
And that is why we need models.
Oh, and regarding the models, so let me give you an example because I had a talk with...
Words, I can see the elephant. I'm not saying I understand everything. In no science do we understand everything. Just look at high energy physics and string theory. But I can see the elephant. I can understand many of the underlying principles and a small number of mechanisms which interactively can generate incredibly complicated properties of psychological experience. Models can see the elephant. Experimental methods alone can test the models and be used to inspire them.
And you need first the theory, because the data doesn't tell you anything if you don't have at first a ground theory. So let me just ask you a question. Just a second. Let me just ask you a question regarding the models, because yesterday I had a talk with Danny Kahneman, and in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he presents model of the brain, system A, system B, system 1, system 2. Now, when he discussed his model, he said, listen, this model is not true in the sense that there is no system A in over here and system B over here, but the model help us understand behavior and predict behavior. Would you say that your models are in a way similar to system 1, system 2?
No. What Danny does is basically a metaphor. Everything is tested on the grounds of how much data you can explain and predict in a principled, unifying way. Danny fails at that test. No other theorist comes close, including Christof. And that's because of the method I developed, the luck of having a profound experimental intuition, and the fact I've worked like a dog for 65 years until incrementally, I've gradually been able to explain properties of many of the most fundamental processes that make us human. But this is a long process. And the reason it worked for me, apart from being lucky and having this intuition and enough mathematical technique to realize it rigorously, is because the brain opportunistically exploits very similar things over and over. There are just a small number of equations that are used all over and over for short-term memory or cell activation, for medium-term memory or activity-dependent habituation, for long-term memory or learning and memory. They're used everywhere in one or another specialized form. Well, I derived those equations along with the paradigm of using nonlinear differential equations in 1957. And they're still being used by everybody, okay? And then there are a small number, larger than the number of equations, of what I like to call modules, which are really characteristic microcircuits, like a recurrent on-center off-surround network that obeys mass action shunting equations, which are the membrane equations of physiology. So the brain exploits mass action competition. Those are used everywhere in specialized form. And finally, I embody them what I call modal architectures, which combine specialized versions of a small number of equations, a somewhat larger number of modules.
And long-term memory and medium-term memory and short-term memory.
Like vision, speech, language, cognition, emotion, action. That's all there is. A small number of equations, a somewhat larger number of modules, and then modal architectures to explain the different modalities of biological intelligence. That is a coherent theory. And in many ways, it's like theoretical physics. They're just a small number of equations in Newton. Then the modules are like molecules. Then the modal architectures are like macroscopic objects.
Okay, so I I think that your distinction between a metaphor and the model is a very important one to make. And I think that you made it, that system one, system two is a metaphor, it's not a model. And now you say that what you present or what you bring to the table are models, and those models are built in hierarchy. So we have like you can start from the atom and go bigger to the molecule and go bigger to the cell and go bigger to the human, etc. So
I would say yes and no, because remember, brain evolution needs to achieve behavioral success. So the art of modeling is to be able to discover, think about, and model the units of the brain that are controlling behavioral success. That is not, a single cell or a single axon. And in fact, that is why classical theorists like Hebb, there's the famous Hebb learning rule. He was a great pioneer in 1949. I deeply admire him. He had the wrong functional unit. He was thinking about it.
The perceptron is basically, he is not the inventor of the perceptron, but he invented or he discovered that the weight of the axons are strengthened in certain scenarios. So the perceptron or the basic of neural nets right now are based on this premise.
You should mention Frank Rosenblatt.
Frank Rosenblatt, of course.
Yeah. And I knew Frank Rosenblatt personally. And the point about the models is because they're incremental and evolutionary, I didn't one day wake up and say, hey, today I'm going to explain why all neocortex has layers of cells and how they work. That was an incremental process, okay? And I've used these lamina cortical models to explain and predict tons of data on multiple levels of experimental verification. So this is all incremental. Frank was older than me. He was a previous generation, but the main point about me is I'm a theoretical psychologist. That's where it all begins, with behavioral success. Anyone who theorizes brain, who doesn't have a profound understanding and a broad knowledge of psychological data, is shooting in the dark. They're shooting blanks, no matter how smart they are, because brain evolution needs to achieve behavioral success.
And again, you cannot start. What you actually say is that if I, as a neuroscientist, going to learn just a single neuron, a single synapse, a single axon, a single dendrite, and from that, without any knowledge of the phenomena of the mental, of the psyche, I'm going to try to derive or to extrapolate the psyche phenomena. This is doomed to failure. Am I correct?
It's going to hit a brick wall very quickly. A brick wall is a kind of failure. It doesn't mean that what you have discovered is false. It means it's insufficient. So
in other ways, I had a talk with Christof Koch in his book called Confession of a Reductionist, romantic reductionist. And by reductionist, he means basically that I can derive the consciousness from the behavior of a single neuron. But well, then Christof Koch...
That's false. And moreover, I don't have to argue it philosophically, and I certainly don't want to argue it in that hominem way. I like Christof, he's exceptionally bright. I argue it on the platform of who explains more data.
Yes, but I think that even...
no contest. So when anyone makes a claim about anything in science, you say, well, what have you explained?
Show me the money.
Nice chat. You say, what have you explained that, for example, Grossberg hasn't already explained? And then shut up and listen, and you'll get silence.
Okay, so again, you said that the process was incremental, yes? And again, this magnum opus is a summary of 60 years of very intense work. But now, oh, okay. But now we are in 2022, and we can look backwards. And from your perspective right now, which model is the easier to explain, is the most easy to explain, the easiest to explain to the general public? Now, we can explain more complex models from your perspective, you know, of your discovery, but maybe more complex model should be simpler to understand, because in a way, a forest is simpler to understand than a tree. Okay, so where should we begin?
First, let me just say that part of the art of modeling is to be able to see the twigs, the branches, the tree, and the forest all in one glance, and to have a modeling language powerful enough to unify them. But let me make another general comment, then I'll give an example. In every case where I feel I've made a breakthrough, I would think about lots of data for a very long time, sometimes 20 years, until I could understand the underlying simple design story whereby I could derive it all with this very simple set of principles. So, for example, you know, you had in one of your questions asked me about visual illusions. And you ask, you know, why am I so interested in them? Well, first, you know, if you look at this famous picture of the Dalmatian in snow, where all
I'm going to show it right now. Okay, but
aren't you prepared? Wonderful.
Yes, of course. Just a second. Sure. 1, 2, 3. By the way, I thought that most of the people can see the Dalmatian, but apparently I showed it to my colleague, and he didn't see a thing. Now, this is the picture, and if you can see right here, you can see a Dalmatian. Okay, right here.
First,
okay,
you're using the wrong word. You don't see it, you recognize it.
Yes, definitely. I'm sorry.
The reason you recognize it, or some people can, people differ in their ability here, you recognize it because amodal or invisible boundaries connect those dots based on the statistics of the picture. And so the question is, why do you have invisible boundaries? And there are several reasons for that.
But just a second, could you just repeat or re-explain what you just said? Because what you said is the statistic of the distribution of the black dots in the picture is somehow different?
Yes, like I can't point the way you can. But for example, look where the head is. You can already see the ear, and you can see the shoulder above it. And then you can connect the shoulder to the leg below it. There are missing pixels. And the other side of the leg, you can connect missing pixels. Right. And then you can see to the right of that, the shadow due to the bottom of the body.
So I start with the ears, and then I'm going backward and say, because let's say that I just saw this part.
You just look at it for a while, and most people within 500 milliseconds or so recognize the dog. You know, don't ask me. Many people report recognizing the dog. And then why this is a fascinating example is you can consciously recognize something that you don't really fully see. So that shows that you don't become conscious to see stuff. It's a counterexample. But then the question is, why do you become conscious at all? And my book tries to explain that.
Okay, so let's so let's go back to my first question. Would you say that conscious or consciousness is when you say consciousness and when the average Joe say consciousness, you mean the same basically the same thing?
There are a number of different aspects to consciousness. What I talk about primarily is consciousness of qualia and consciousness of invisible representations that are created by automatic early visual processes, like in the case of Dalmatian, which are then recognized and seen consciously with the understanding from the recognition that the partial figure is a dog, a Dalmatian. So the bottom line is I never tried to understand consciousness. You don't wake up in the morning and say, hey, today I'll understand consciousness. Let me leap ahead a little and then you might want me to move back. But the main claim is the models of learning that I, and with collaboration of many very gifted collaborators, notably Gail Carpenter, are models of learning led to insights about consciousness. And the reason is that in 1978, I think it was, I introduced what's called adaptive resonance theory, or ART, which has been incrementally developed to the present time to become the most mature cognitive and neural theory about how our brains learn to pay attention to, recognize, and predict objects and events as the world is changing all around us. And in adaptive resonance theory, some of the mechanisms that occur, first there's learning. Learning has to be buffered against catastrophic forgetting, which is one of the big problems of backpropagation deep learning. Never was a problem in adaptive resonance theory, because I showed how learned top-down expectations are matched against the bottom-up feature patterns to focus attention on a subset of critical features that are used to predict successful outcomes, and those are the features that are learned in bottom-up adaptive filters and top-down expectations. And so far I've mentioned the word learning,
expectations. I think that the word expectation is a big fundamental word.
Let me finish the thought. And then when you have your learned bottom-up filter and your learned top-down expectation, if the bottom-up features match the expectation well enough, it goes through the bottom-up filter and the top-down expectation in a cycle, a self-reinforcing cycle that says, yeah, this is the right recognition category.
And this is resonant.
And it synchronizes the attended cells and the resonating category. So learning, expectation, attention, resonance, and synchrony. And it was then after a while I realized that the contents of these patterns are what we are consciously recognizing. So that was consciousness, learning, expectation, attention, resonance, synchrony, spells clears, the word clears. That's why I say art shows how the clears processes are linked to enable us to consciously recognize things. Notice I didn't say consciously see things, because classical art generates a feature category resonance from critical features to recognition category. That's for recognition. Seeing, and that'll go on in the ventral cortical what stream. like between visual cortical area V4 and infratemporal cortex.
So now we have like a basic understanding of conscious and what resonant means, which I think that now we can go a little bit deeper. And you, in a recent talk, you told your friend Dick Samuel to write equations that would explain how the brain gives rise to mind. And I think that this is
recent. That was a celebration of the 15th anniversary of the Department of Cognitive Neural Systems that I founded and chaired for 17 years. And it also was a celebration of my 65th birthday. So now I'm 82.
Okay, so it wasn't recent, but
and it's a long time ago.
Yes, okay, but I think that this statement still holds true. Yes.
Oh yeah.
Okay, but my question is that dealing with what is likely to be the most challenging question of all times must have been a tough road with many ups, downs, and brick walls, as we have discussed before. And my question is, in this long journey, what was the hardest problem you faced and how did you overcome it? So could you share with us some of the delightful aha moments that, oh, I just solved something that was immensely challenging?
I have some notes of that. I don't want to forget to say what I'd like to say about that. So let me look at my notes. You know, I'm jumping around a lot, and I like to be able to be informative. So I do specifically, so I'm getting there.
Okay.
I use your questions as an excuse to say a lot of other stuff.
Okay.
I'm trying to find this.
So what is your answer?
Well, I was always drawn to the hardest problems. The problems that I sensed intuitively were fundamental. And often I sensed this visually. I could imagine things, or affectively. I just felt drawn to them before I could formulate any concept or sentence about them. With some of them, I realized I wasn't ready to study them. But then again, due to an intuitive gift, I guess, I would study related things that seemed interesting and relevant until I had, sometimes 5, 10, 20 years later, put together all the pieces that I say, aha, now I'm ready. So the thing that's guided me along, and you know, when you say what's hard, it's my experimental intuition. That is my gift, seeing to the heart of data. And I have managed to get enough technique by getting a PhD in mathematics, and I'm a full professor of mathematics, Emeritus. But the intuition was everything. You can't expect a computer program or a mathematical method to make a discovery like this. Just like with all the great scientists, if you ask Niels Bohr, how did he think of his model of the atom? He could never tell you how. And with Einstein, I love the anecdote. Someone asked Einstein, Professor Einstein, where is your laboratory? And he went. So
maybe your great theory of mind.
I wouldn't study it if it wasn't hard. There was no hardest. It's like saying, what's your favorite problem? It's like saying, who's your favorite child? They were all hard until I made them seem easy. Let's put it that way.
Okay, thank you. Now, in your book, you speak about some brain disorders and how to understand them from the perspective of your mind theory. Could you please share with us one example? And I would like the example, and I would like to hear about Alzheimer, as you discussed in chapter 5 of the book.
Yeah, well, I would always be developing my models mostly using data about normal behavior.
Just a second, you are touching the paper and the microphone.
I want to get to my notes to be sure I don't.
Okay. Yes, Steve.
Well, I never tried to understand mental disorders, just like I never tried to understand consciousness. They all come through the back door. They're the gift that keeps on giving if you respect the data and honor it and try to understand it in a principled way. Data about normal or typical behaviors are far more abundant and parametric and organized than data about mental disorders, which after all are mostly case studies. Of course, there's some neuropharmacology, but there's nothing to tell you how giving a certain drug that might influence the excitability of certain receptor can help prevent a symptom of autism or Alzheimer's. That's a huge leap. It's linking brain to behavior, which is what we need models for. So I spent a lot of time, many years, trying to understand how certain normal behaviors work. But then at a certain point, I just happened to notice that, if there were certain imbalances or breakdowns in the normal models, they would generate formal behavioral symptoms of particular mental disorders. And I wondered, is this an accident or is this an opportunity? And the models were needed there because remember, the behavioral symptoms, just like all behavior, are emergent properties of particular brain mechanisms interacting together. And so as of this date, I've been bold or rash enough to propose neural explanations of behavioral symptoms of Alzheimer's, autism, medial temporal amnesia, schizophrenia, PTSD, ADHD, auditory and visual agnosia and neglect, and some problems in slow wave sleep. So, in particular, any process that prevents an adaptive resonance from being sustained long enough to support, for example, conscious recognition and learning, it won't get conscious. And so I've written, for example, how breakdowns in how the nucleus basalis of minor and its release of acetylcholine signals in layer 5 of multiple regions of cortex can cause symptoms of diseases like Alzheimer's disease and autism. And that's part of the art orienting system whereby art tries to respond to a predictive mismatch. So what's perhaps the first predictive coding model? When there's a mismatch with incoming data, that leads to reset of the current hypothesis or category and drives hypothesis testing or memory search for a new category to be learned, or if it's something you know, but you are paying attention to something a little different, or you can go quickly through direct access to the correct category. So if that process breaks down badly enough, cortical resonances can't form to support consciousness, and you can experience a vegetative state. So yeah, I was led through with my graduate student, Max Versace, to try to better understand the art orienting system, reset, and memory search. And through that, we were led to the nucleus basalis, non-specific thalamus, acetylcholine. And then I noticed only later when I'm reading the literature, I read a lot of the experimental literature, acetylcholine was all over in the descriptions of mental disorders and how some of them are caused. Not to say that that's the only cause, even in something like autism. Multiple things go wrong in autism, as reflected by the fact that autism is due to a multi-gene problem in development. It's one of the things. And I think my book gives a diagram where I show that one thing and then at least summarize some of the others that elsewhere in the book are discussed.
Now, could we use your model of Alzheimer, or again, we use your mind model to explain Alzheimer? So not just as a great story that something bad happens and therefore we cannot, and the resonant mechanism doesn't work, but can we use your model to A, predict whether a person is going to have Alzheimer, and B, maybe treat Alzheimer in better ways?
Well, the acetylcholine part of the story in Alzheimer's is only part of the story. You know, there are plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, and I do not explain all of those processes. You know, maybe if I'm drawn back to it in the future and I can intuitively see a path, I might return to it. But I think what the theory already does is it explains how this cholinergic failure can undermine learning. And I also in my book refer to various people who have realized that using cholinergic agonists can often help. So at very least, my work explains how that can be and may encourage further work in that direction. You know, it's one thing to try something out and it helps. It's another thing to understand how it helps. And moreover, my work leads to a clear understanding of how that breakdown prevents learning, resonance, and consciousness from happening, which is not part of any of the empirical discussions. So people who take it to heart, I think the best thing to do in cases like this, which I've noticed throughout my whole life, when you're talking to different experimentalists, they have different sets of techniques at their disposal. And it's through a dialogue that you can try to figure out with them, are any of their current methods able to do more? But for example, you know, there are lots of wonderfully gifted young neuroscientists who have fallen in love with optogenetic methods. And, you know, I listen to a lot of their lectures on Zoom and when we don't have COVID in person. And the sad thing to me about it is often what they discover using their method about learning or whatever is already known. They just have a fancy way to repeat something that's known.
And it is known in the field of psychology?
It's often been already modeled. So what I will do, without trying to be a pest, I will write them an email thanking them for their lovely talk and saying, by the way, did you know about these results? Maybe they'll be useful to you in your future experiments. And then I wait and see who responds. Most of them can't respond because of the way that NIH and other grant agencies work.
Isaiah, if you don't know what NIH is, it's not invented here. Therefore, it's not my idea. Therefore, I cannot accept it. Okay.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is sadder, at least for a time. I don't know if it's improved in the last few years. In order to get an NIH grant to do a certain experiment, because
NIH, okay, I'm sorry.
Questions that were asked were so demanding, often experimentalists had to have already done the experiment. And therefore, they could, with some assurance, know it was going to work out, but they wrote the grant to support their next experiment. That was the unwritten text. Now, maybe.
So I am sorry. So this is not NIH. NIH is like a very big one. But you know, many people, and I think Gary Marcus raised a very similar point regarding deep learning. People in the deep learning industry or the deep learning community or the artificial intelligence community don't read works or research paper outside their community. They don't read work from neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, and therefore many things that they try to invent have been already invented many years ago. And this is a sad thing. And you said basically the same thing in the field of neuroscience. Would you agree?
Well, I think that there are differences in kind between the neuroscience and deep learning example. First, older experimentalists often do link brain to behavior in a brilliant way, including Bob Desimone and Earl Miller at MIT, both of whom I've known for many years. Bob, since he was a postdoc with Mortimer Mishkin at the National Institute of Health. So there are wonderful experiments that very skillfully link brain mechanism to behavior. They can't fully explain the behavior, but that's where my models help. I'm talking about a newer breed of experimentalists who are blinded by the new shiny thing. And in order to get or keep a grant, they have to do very narrow studies. And many of them haven't studied the literature either experimentally or modeling. Now with deep learning, it's a different matter. Because it has an unfortunate history. You know, backpropagation was discovered by people like Shinichi Amari, Paul Werbos, David Parker, and it wasn't discovered by Rummel, Hart, Hinton, and Williams, and they knew Paul Werbos's work. Paul published it in 75. They published, Rummel, Hart et al. Published their paper in 86. They even have a little citation of Paul in their paper, which sort of absolves them of plagiarism, even though it was plagiarism. And so in this background of rediscovery without proper citation, mind you, I don't view citation as a personal thing. I view it as an educational necessity. so that students can follow the history of ideas.
But if they cited Frank Rommel, I think, so what the problem is? Because you said
what?
you said that they had in the backpropagation in the 86 paper regarding backpropagation that they cited, you know, the original paper about backpropagation from the 70s. So if they,
I think they might have mentioned it. I might be confusing it with another paper. You can easily check. But they gave the impression, whether or not he was mentioned, that what they were doing was new. That's the problem. I heard Dave Rummelhart present the first lectures on backpropagation at a conference where I was with Gail Carpenter, among other colleagues. We were shocked that he presented it as a new algorithm. That's what mattered. That's what they've always done. Now, as to deep learning, you know, Jeff Hinton never mentions anything but deep learning. You know, if you interview Jeff, and I've heard some of his interviews on videos, you would think there was no field of neural networks. There was no other classifier. You know, the fact that backprop and deep learning, as I had already published in 1988 in the first issue of the journal Neural Networks, it's unreliable because, you know, it's unreliable because it experiences catastrophic begetting, and it's also unexplainable. I forget what other phrase I use for that. You know, you do not know why it works, if it works. And
you know, you quote Jeff Hinton in your book and about what he said, that he's deeply suspicious of backpropagation. I don't think it is how the brain works. We clearly don't need all the label data. My view is throw it all away and start over. So
yes,
this is like.
But what Jeff is implicitly saying is, you have to start over. He doesn't at that point say, which would have been intellectually honest, we've been pushing this too long. The problems that backprop and deep learning have are incurable, but there are alternatives like adaptive resonance theory. We have to start all over implies there's nothing there. It's very unfortunate. And what I meant to say, deep learning is untrustworthy because it's unexplainable, and unreliable because experiencing a catastrophic begetting. Remember that.
So let's move, and I think that this is the best place, or the best part of the interview, to just focus on the art, on adaptive resonant theory, because in your seminal paper, you said that adaptive resonant theory is better than deep learning in 17 points, I think, or deep learning has 17 drawbacks, 17 bad things. So let's focus on adaptive resonant theory. And you have already started to explain it briefly, but can you explain it to the general public? Let's say that I know what a perceptron is, and I know what a very simple neural network or artificial neural network is, and how the neural network learn its weight. So could you please explain in the simplest words possible what is adaptive resonant theory?
Sure. So I'm going to walk around it and then zoom into it. So I would claim that adaptive resonance theory is now, as I said, I think a moment ago, the most advanced cognitive and neural theory about how our brains learn to attend, recognize, and predict objects and events in a changing world. So I'm going to tell you properties of before I say what it is. All of the foundational hypotheses have been supported by subsequent psychological and neurobiological experiments, and art has explained hundreds of additional experiments. A critical feature here, you might say, well, why is it so successful? In 1980, I published an article in Psychological Review, which was then and may still be the leading theory journal in psychology. And in it, I showed, this was after lots of thought since '76 about explaining data and this and that, how to derive art from a thought experiment. And especially people who revere Einstein know that he derived special relativity theory and general relativity theory from thought experiments. Why thought experiments are powerful is you use just a few simple facts that everyone knows. You don't have to know science to derive the theory. And that's what I did with art. And in that way, I showed that art could be derived from a thought experiment about how any learning system could autonomously correct predictive errors in a changing world. Any system. I never mention mind or brain. That means that art is a kind of universal solution of this prediction problem. And the very fact that the hypotheses that go into it are familiar to all of us is due to the fact that these hypotheses are ubiquitous environmental pressures on how our brains have developed through evolution. So if you read the thought experiment, there's really no way out. It's not like saying, well, I don't believe his data. There ain't no data. Okay, so this universal solution I call a solution of the stability plasticity dilemma. That problem is, how do you learn quickly? Is where you get the plasticity.
But you maintain the knowledge.
The stability is without catastrophic forgetting. So the very thing that backprop fails to do, I had already shown by 1980, art doesn't have that problem, okay? And that's why I think it's remarkable that art also clarifies, of course I had to think more and do more, it gives explicit models of how we consciously see, hear, feel, and know things about the world, and use conscious representations to plan and act in the world. So we don't become conscious only to platonically contemplate the beauty of the world. We become conscious to use conscious awareness to effectively act in the world so we can survive. Now, the conscious states all arise from resonances which occur when excitatory feedback signals, bottom-up and top-down feedback signals between two or more processing levels match well enough with incoming data in order to resonate, because it's a good enough match, and choose the recognition category and learn around it. That's where you get consciousness learning, expectation, tension, resonance, and synchrony. So it's because that sustained resonance triggers fast learning without catastrophic forgetting. That's why I called it adaptive resonance theory. So to me, I love to be able to say without a shred of embarrassment that I've proposed a solution to the mind-body problem that arises from a computational analysis of how humans and other animals autonomously learn in a changing world. It's all about self-organization, just like now. I've learned a lot about you. You've learned a lot about me in real time. You'll remember it tomorrow, I hope. If not, you have a video to keep you warm. But we learn quickly without catastrophic forgetting. That is what art is about. And because the hypotheses in these thought experiments lead to cognitive models like adaptive resonance theory, as well as cognitive emotional models that are called vector associative maps, they never mention mind and brain, the thought experiments. They're universal solutions. And that's why I think in the future, as science and technology develop increasingly autonomous algorithms and mobile robots, art gives a universal solution to the problem of autonomous adaptive intelligence. I think these algorithms will look like variations of art because it solves this universal solution about correcting predictive errors in a changing world. And that's not personal. If you can see a mistake in the thought experiment, my claim collapses. But the fact is, it's already explained a ton of stuff.
But Steve,
go on and give you an example of.
Oh, because just a second. But before you give me the example, I have a PhD in artificial intelligence, deep learning. Now, let's say that I'm looking of a convolutional neural net or something like this, and then we have a picture of a cat. So I know what the CovNet does. It goes through the cat in like convolutional squares and then search for like edges, etc., blah, 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 blah. So I know, and then it, updated the weights, but we have no expectations. We have just whether the output match the label. If the output matches the label, good. If the output doesn't match the label, so we need to change by backpropagation. So this I can understand.
If you don't sparsify your network, you will experience catastrophic forgetting. There'll be catastrophic interference. That's one of the problems that a lot of the networks have. They have to get very, very big to keep their categories sparse.
Okay. And now could you,
the point about art and our brain, the representations can be very compact. You can have a single cell population in anterior infratemporal cortex that will respond to an invariant representation of your face, seeing it with every size, every orientation, every position on the screen, a single population.
So can we take this?
And it's because of that such an invariant representation can now learn how to get motivationally biased by interacting with brain regions like amygdala. If it were a distributed representation everywhere, you couldn't have that cognitive emotional resonance. You therefore couldn't pay motivated attention to your mother's face. That matters.
But something strikes me. Where do the expectations come from? Where do the expectations
come from? You have to be more explicit.
Okay, let's say.
The fact is, there are more top-down pathways at every stage of the brain than there are bottom-up pathways. So what do you mean, where do they come from? They're ubiquitous. Top-down learning is ubiquitous at every stage of the brain. It even goes down to the lateral geniculate nucleus. In fact, one of the data sets that I simulate, I think maybe it was in '84, I love the work of Adam Silito on how oh God, it's such a long time ago, how you get a thalamocortical resonance in which the properties of atoms, beautiful physiological data, exactly match the art matching rule for top-down.
Okay, so let me rephrase my question.
And also Nobuo Suga, who was one of the greatest people working on audition in the bat, came and lectured to our department. I like him very much. He was the person who introduced me to shirashi at a neighborhood Japanese restaurant. He showed a circuit of how learning occurs in the bat. It was the art matching rule circuit. Right down.
Okay, so with your permission, let me rephrase my question. Based on your initial motivation, and we discussed it before, of understanding how the brain gives rise to the mind, it seems to me that art mainly comes to help answering this question, as opposed to being the best AI model as measured by benchmark for classification, regression, ImageNet, MNIST, etc. From your perspective, does a potential contribution of art is more to the domain of neuroscience, like understanding the brain better, or in the AI practical applications?
No, well, first, given how art is derived, it's a universal solution of a prediction problem. The successes in deep learning have a dirty secret. The dirty secret is that there's specialty pre-processing and parameter fitting, and it solves one problem and no other unless you retrofit it again and again and again. Art is more general purpose than that. Art does have pre-processing, like visual cortex, auditory cortex, and art has been benchmarked. And it hasn't been benchmarked for a number of years, but when it was benchmarked, I think, was it 2010? I forget, seems so long ago. It did better than every algorithm out there as compared with their own benchmarks, okay? Including backpropagation. It blew backprop out of the water. Backprop needed, what was it, 10,000 epochs or something to get to an accuracy art got in 1 or 2 trials. It's just ridiculous. And then art is used for kinds of applications that you'd never dream of using these other algorithms for. For example, Gail Carpenter has been a very good leader in this. Gail has developed with doctors at various of the hospitals in the Boston area medical database prediction algorithms where the data and also remote sensing map creation algorithms. Well, let's say the data will come from multiple observers. Each of them describes their data using their own terms. There can be missing data, or the data can be incomplete, or some of the classifications can be inconsistent. Gail shows how fuzzy art map can be used to learn a cognitive hierarchy of rules that converts this messy data from all these sources into rule-like consistent knowledge. And it discovers its own hierarchy going from more concrete to increasingly abstract categories. I think I showed a picture of that in the book.
But I must tell you,
none of them can touch these problems.
But I must tell you, Steve, what you are describing now seems almost too good to be true. Almost too good to be true. And my question is...
But don't say that's borderline pejorative, Roy. This has been published in the top remote sensing journals and analogous medical prediction journals.
No, I'm not saying that you...
These are archival studies. It's not almost too good to be true. It has been done.
No. I don't say that what you're saying is just something that hasn't been done, but I'm saying something else. I had my PhD in deep learning artificial intelligence, and I try to read, the most recent papers and in the field of artificial intelligence. And my question, and I think that this is a fair question, if art is so good, how have I have never, up until 3 weeks ago, when my friend said, listen, you must talk with this guy, he is amazing, Steve Grossberg, I have never heard the term art, not in the artificial intelligence general approach, and I have never seen it applied, in TensorFlow or PyTorch. Or we know we strive, to make the best convolutional classification algorithm, and there you go and say, listen, we have something much better. How have I ever, never heard about adaptive resonant theory?
First, keep in mind, I've been called the Einstein of the mind, not just the Einstein of category learning. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy that young people are not being trained to know all the tools that are available in the field. When we had our Department of Cognitive and Neural Systems, we developed a curriculum that we viewed as our responsibility to train our students in all available algorithms, not just ours and not just biologically relevant ones. And that's why a lot of them went on to get really terrific jobs in technology. They were trained. It's a problem in that community. It's a sociological problem. They do it because they've gotten away with it, okay? And, but truth can only be denied for so long. So in my world, people use art for hundreds of large-scale applications. One of the people who's done a lot, but far from the only one, is Don Wunsch at the Missouri University of Science and Technology in Rolla, Missouri. That's MST. But like if you look at our Tech Lab webpage, what is it saying, like tech@cns.bu.edu. Even there, if you look at it under applications or something like that, you'll see a long partial list of large-scale applications. I might have listed some of the applications in my book. For example, art was used in a CAD system to design the Boeing 727 or 707, I forget. Maybe 740.
Yeah, you mentioned this in the book.
747.
It's a great example.
And the people at Boeing didn't use it because I knew them. They looked around for every algorithm around. They're engineers. Engineers don't fool around. They've got to solve the problem. They chose art because it was the only algorithm that could do it. And that's been true in so many of the applications. So one of the things, whenever we have done a benchmark, we compared it with every algorithm out there. And we also wanted to be very clear about how those algorithms might have set up the simulation environment. I don't see benchmarks with deep learning. I just see, it's like, well, let me say it another way.
You see benchmark within the deep learning community.
Let me say it another way. Backprop became popular due to intense marketing by Rumelhart et al. Until people began to see its problems, like it's untrustworthy, it's unreliable, things that you can't use an untrustworthy, unreliable algorithm for a medical database prediction, a financial prediction, Because if something goes wrong, you can't explain how it worked. You'll be sued for everything you're worth.
Yes.
Okay? So,
so basically what you are saying that the new trend of explainable AI is basically goes against many of the pillars of deep learning, because explainable AI strive to explain why and not how, why the algorithm produced the output that it produced. Would you
if you
agree?
look at the things I've looked at, and I cite some of the things the other algorithms trying to do better in my book, it's like, what do I call it? I call it like epicycles, before you got the Copernican view of the universe, you had the Ptolemaic view of the universe, and it didn't work. So you kept adding this and adding that and adding that. These are epicycles. And the problem is, if you have something that is unreliable and untrustworthy, you've got to sweat it to make it do anything that someone will trust. And until you can solve those problems, which you can't as it stays a feed-forward adaptive filter, you can huff and puff all you want. My advice to young people is, don't spend your life working on something for too long that will hit a brick wall. Certainly today, if you can get a job in a technology firm where they're using deep learning, offline, slow learning, to try to get the prediction of something, and they pay you a good salary because you know how to do it, well, a job is a job is a job. But that doesn't say anything about the future. It's not up to me to try to explain why Apple and Google and other big companies that should be able to read the literature use an algorithm that's untrustworthy and unreliable. What,
Okay, so let me be more practical. Let's say that a young engineer, young computer scientist, hear this conversation and he say, "Listen, I've never heard about art before, and this is interesting. Can I apply art, adaptive resonance theory, in my research, in my AI research?" So you say absolutely can. You can do it. And you won't find many tutorials on YouTube, and you won't find many tutorials on Medium and throughout data science. But keep in mind that this is a very promising algorithm that outperforms many of the algorithms of deep learning, including convolutional neural network and feed-forward networks, that you should try to take a look at.
I think it should be part of your repertoire. And if you have a very narrowly defined problem, some algorithm may be better for that repertoire. Gail had developed what she called default art and art map. It's on this Tech Lab webpage. Ironically, it doesn't have top-down feedback. It has something almost like it to stabilize it. In Don Wunsch's work, if you look up Donald, I forget his initial, Wunsch the second, I think, at Missouri University of Science and Technology. He has a lot of papers that use art for large scale applications. So you could see it at work in that lab. And then I know there are hundreds of other people who use it. For example, many years ago, I was giving a lecture and a guy came up to me after and he said, "I want you to know that the National Security Agency is using art to protect the nation." But of course, you can never find that out because that's top secret, high security stuff. So There are hundreds of practitioners doing large-scale applications. I lost track of it a long time ago.
Okay, so let me go further. So
People,
from your
most
perspective,
people don't feel the need to market and hype deep learning beyond its capability. It upsets me greatly to see people who should know better hinting that deep learning can help us to finally begin to understand how the brain works. No, it can't. It doesn't obey. Remember, it has a non-local transport of weight, like backprop, which doesn't exist anywhere in the brain. And the brain is not unreliable and untrustworthy. And there is huge literature explaining how the brain makes the mind. So that's very sad. That's intellectually dishonest.
and this is the best, I think the biggest motivation that I had for this talk was that I was never aware of this art, and I wanted, to change the situation, make engineers and computer scientists and other person in my field which don't know what art is, and they are not taught this in the university, okay, just open their eyes to other algorithms or other frameworks as well. So this is another question.
Boy, what's extraordinary about that? We live in the world of Google. But, I don't want to overstate this, and I'm not saying that this is quite true of the learning community, which I'm sure is doing its best in good faith. But whenever you get a cult-like atmosphere, you just don't look outside. Anyone who wants to know about this stuff just has to do a quick Google search. It's all there, all over, all over. I mean, for example, you talk about people don't know it. Well, during COVID, I've been invited to give keynote lectures at international conferences all over the world. Ankara, Tehran, I'm blocking, Beijing, Melbourne, Bangkok.
And you discussed art?
Next month, I'm giving one in Marseille. These are international conferences, all different topics. Don't any people in deep learning go or listen to these international conferences? That's what I mean. It's like a cult. I'm not unknown. I've been giving keynote lectures all over the world during COVID, and I've lectured hundreds of times giving keynote lectures all over the world before COVID for 40 or 50 years. I mean, it's sad. It's just, I think it's very sad. I'm not saying there's no more work to do, either to develop art algorithmically or to understand more about mind and brain. But the fact you don't know it even exists, that's really sad.
And this podcast and this channel and this interview, this conversation, I think is another, step forward in making art and making adaptive resonance theory more common between computer scientists like me, engineers, and other people as well. What would I would make link.
I got the IEEE Frank Rosenblatt Award. That's engineers. The IEEE Computational Science Frank Rosenblatt Award in Computational Neuroscience. Engineers know about me. It's just you don't know about me. Deep learning nudniks don't know about me. You're not engineers. Not in the broad sense. A good engineer looks for all available tools to solve his or her problem. They don't accept that it's a deep learning world. Okay, I say that passionately
Yeah,
because
definitely.
I have always read the literature. I feel I must know what other people are doing and thinking.
Definitely. And I think that this is so important. And what you said is so important. And I will put links in the description below to sources that you can find about art. It's not just the Wikipedia page, because the Wikipedia page, and I've covered the Wikipedia page, in my opinion, doesn't explain you, how to utilize art, especially if you come from the computer science and TensorFlow. You think, like a bridge between the theory and how to apply it, but you should. And I think that this is like a very important conclusion from our discussion. Try searching outside the box.
Please link to my new book, both
yeah,
the
definitely
University Press and the Amazon link. And the reason is I wrote the book in order to provide one-stop shopping to give people a self-contained, non-technical overview in a conversational style about high points of my intellectual journey. Of course, then you have to look at archival papers. I give citations to them. I give citations to the work of many hundreds of other people, because this is a big world and I honor those contributions. And I wish that deep learning would open up its cult-like little cocoon and take a deep breath and enjoy the richness of contributions to our engineering and technology and AI.
Wow. Steve, I must tell you, this was one hell of a conversation. And you even, I don't know how you say it in English, me, which is great. Thank you so much. I think I wanted to cover so much, but it was immensely interesting. So first, let me thank you for your lifelong work and what you have done to science. Everything that we do, is another stone in the giant, great building of science. And I think that you have put many stones in this building. So first, thank you so much. I think that we will need to go for round B and cover many of the things that we haven't covered.
I have to remark, I've also been blessed with having over 100 very gifted PhD students and postdocs, in addition to closer collaborators who I've worked with on many projects, like the love of my life, Gail Carpenter.
Which is great, being like your wife, being your partner in one of the greatest achievements of yours, inventing or discovering adaptive resonant theory. It should cover a whole different conversation. So Steve, again, thank you so much. And I wish you many more years of good health and good contribution to science. Your work is mind-boggling.
And thank you for having me on your program. And please send me a URL where I could see what survives after you cut and paste.
No, I'm not cutting and pasting anything.
Wonderful. Well, then I'll enjoy it all the more. I hope I haven't said anything too cringeworthy.
No, you just nudnik deep learning. But beside this,
well, I think it's sad, because it can be useful and it has been useful, but it's one of many tools, and people should be able to make that choice.
You are absolutely correct. And I think this is the very reason why this conversation was extremely important to my colleagues, because again, maybe it's my fault that I didn't know enough about art or adaptive resonant theory, but let me assure you, I read the literature and I read many books, and I've never came across adaptive resonant theory, and so do my colleagues. So it's not just my fault. It's like maybe it's the fault of the cult, of computer science today, of deep learning today, because I try to go outside and search and look and speak with many people.
Well, if I can make one more comment, you know, algorithms like deep learning are feed-forward algorithms. And all of brain is feedback, including nonlinear feedback. That's the great divide with a lot of people. They just shy away from this ubiquitous foundational design constraint on how we become intelligent, how we learn anything at all. And what my book does is to tame that. What my life did was to tame it. And like the art matching loop, what does it mean to pay attention? How many different kinds of attention are there? What are their different functions? Where do they occur in the brain? Why is that related to consciousness? These are all now at least partially solved problems. But I say, you know, if people want to get started, they should start with my new book, Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain, How Each Brain Makes a Mind. I didn't mention it won the 2022 Prose Book Award in Neuroscience from the Association of American Publishers. So some people have liked it. And if you read the reviews, the 22 pre-publication reviews from very distinguished psychologists, neuroscientists, and some
Yes,
very
definitely.
technologists, and then over 80 five-star reviews on
Amazon.
I think I sent you an email.
Yeah, definitely.
Just
This
read
is a very impressive book.
If
Now,
you
again, I hope that you enjoyed the conversation as much as I do.
I have. Can't you tell?
Yes, you are smiling, and this is so great. Okay, thank you so much, Steve, for your time. And the minute I'm going to upload this, I'm going to send you the link. Thank you again.
Thank you, Roy. Okay.
Bye-bye.